Welcome to Educators in VR, everyone. It's so great to see you. Wow, we're really getting populated. I love this. Welcome. And if you're in a VR, hello, yes, I'm sorry, I'm not in VR, so I can't wave, but I'm waving to you in spirit. So welcome, and we are really excited to have some excellent guest today. But before we get going, I just want to introduce you to Educators in VR really quickly. And as you came in, you may have noticed a couple of banners there that will tell you a little bit about Educators in VR and all of the remarkable programming that they do. They have many different communities that are very active on their Discord channel. I am one of the co-facilitators with Stands with Trees for the Diversity channel. And so this is a presentation that we are hosting under Educators in VR today. We're really excited about it. I want to apologize really quickly in advance if my head flops around for a second, because what I'm about to do, for those of you who don't know this little trick, I'm on a Mac and I want to be able to see my laptop for a moment so that I can read my introduction. So I'm hitting Control and up. I don't know what that's going to do to my head, so forgive me if it flops around. All right. So I want to tell you a little bit about our very special guests that are joining us today. Michael Avis, I'm sorry if I got that wrong. I'll say Avis. Michael, did I get that right? Is it Avis? We're going to say, I hope that was Avis. It's the founder of Tapvigo Solutions. Tapvigo is a communication solutions company, and they use immersive technology to level up your communication needs. And Christophe, or Chris Mallet, is co-founder of Bodyswaps, a skills training immersive platform offering comprehensive soft skills training. Together, these two amazing pioneers collaborated with Canada-based George Brown College to develop Let's Talk About Race. They presented their protocol at AWE earlier this year, and now they are bringing it to you and to us here at Educators in VR. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Michael Avis and Chris Mallet.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if the clapping works. Oh, clapping emoji, well done. So hi everyone, I'm Chris. I'm French, as you can hear, but I'm based in London, UK, so it's like 9 p.m. here or 8 p.m. I'm the CEO of Bodyswaps, and what Bodyswaps is basically, it's like a flight simulator for soft skills. So using a combination of immersive, VR, and an AI, we give learners a safe place to practice having a difficult conversation. And I think one such difficult conversation, especially in our culture today, is about race. And about a year and a half ago, as Michael was still working at George Brown College in Toronto, Canada, we worked together for about 6 months across the ocean to try to create something, to leverage the technology to try to create something that would allow students to be better equipped to have conversations about race with one another. Michael, do you want to say more?
Sure. I'm Michael Avis. Just to let you know, it looks like there's some people stranded outside still. I'm not sure if they're trying to get in. I can look over my shoulder. I'm in a VR headset, and I'm in Toronto, Canada. It's 3 o'clock p.m. here. If you see my arms do anything weird, I haven't broken them and I haven't dropped my coffee. It's just I've got 2 controllers here, so sometimes if I'm resting, they might make some strange movements. So if we can rescue some people outside, that would be great. Yeah. So
yes,
as Chris mentioned,
confusing that the door is closed. That you have to teleport through the door.
Oh, okay. If one of the facilitators could go help rescue some people, that would be great. So I used to work at George Brown College.
It's all under. They're
all coming in.
Our pod crew is working just great. Hi, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you. So I worked at George Brown College as a teacher. I've been a teacher for 24 years, and the last 5 years of that, I was a faculty facilitator. So I was working with faculty on thinking about teaching and learning. I think we could probably advance the slide, Chris, if we can, Sarah. So in my work, one of the questions that I often get is, why do we talk about race? Why does it matter? Why is this necessary? So I put up this picture to kind of give you a visual of how I've been thinking about this. And these are my 3 lovely children. and this is their school right next to it. It's the typical downtown Toronto school. It's got musty smells and best friend groups and squabbles in the playground, Pokemon card trading, all those things that kids do. And they're going to spend 8 of their years living or being in this building. And they may actually spend more time talking to their teachers than they will to their parents. So it matters to me because these teachers are ready to have challenging conversations about inclusion and equity opportunity. And it matters that my children and any children have a level playing field to play, grow, and flourish. And that includes being in public education and being in educational settings, whether it's a primary school, college, university. So I need to go back a little bit here. So back in February 2021, at the height of the pandemic, I won't bring that up because I know we're all traumatized by that, at least I was. All 3 of my kids were in virtual school. So they were in my kitchen and I could hear what was happening in the classes. And you know, they were sitting and they were listening. And in February, it's Black History Month in North America. I'm not sure for those of you around the world whether you celebrate that or not, but it's a month to celebrate contributions and achievements by African descendants. And 2021 was a particularly poignant because it was almost a year after the murder of George Floyd. And this was, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, this was a man who was killed by law enforcement in Minneapolis. And there's a lot of things that happened socially in Canada and around the world because of that. And there was a great effort to talk about the incident at school and to talk about race and diversity in general. And as I was sitting in the kitchen and I was listening to these teachers talk about race and starting to talk about the George Floyd murder, I was a little bit troubled about what I heard. So an effort was being made to speak about these things, and it's true. And I want to make this very clear. I am a teacher, so I'm always going to stand by educators and teachers. But it was really evident to me that the teachers were ill prepared and they weren't ready and comfortable to have conversations that were damaging to kids. And they were kind of exacerbating some deep held biases and stereotypes that I thought was problematic. This made me think, if these conversations are happening at my kids' school, where else are they happening? And what other schools are they happening in? And what other institutions are these conversations going on? So I took off my parent hat and I put on my teacher hat, and I started to think, what can we do to enable these teachers, other teachers, and not just teachers, but I say educators because educators, you know, it goes across all sectors and not just the education sector, but how do we enable people to have conversations about race that don't do damage and that support and build these communication that we want to have? And that's where I reached out to Chris.
So Sarah, if you
go
want
to
to
the next slide. Yep.
Next slide. I think I'll raise my hand every time. All right, so
Okay.
the big question is, when we talk about difficult conversation and race, it's about empathy. So it's about changing very deep human behavior. And so there's a legitimate question on I don't know if you can go full screen on the presentation. That would be nice. But there's a question on whether you can use virtual reality to create empathy. And there's this one study from 2016 by a British researcher called Mallet that was particularly important in the creation of Bodyswaps. Mallet's idea was to say that patients suffering from being very depressed have an excess of self-criticism and a deficiency in empathy towards themselves. And so he devised, you can recognize the Oculus DK1, he devised this experience where 16 patients would be in virtual reality, embodying an avatar that looked like themselves in an environment that looked like where they were in the real world, in that blue room, wearing a motion capture, a mocap suit. And they would find themselves, after playing a little bit in front of a mirror to take ownership of their virtual body, they would find themselves in front of the character of a little girl crying. And their job was to speak for 90 seconds and say nice things to that little girl so that she would stop crying. There's absolutely no AI. The character will stop crying whatever you say. And after 90 seconds, they would swap body with that little girl. So they would find themselves in the body of that character. And because the movements were recorded with the mocap suit and because the voice were recorded, they essentially watching a replay from the other character's perspective of themselves, giving those words of compassion. And so they're essentially receiving words of compassion from themselves via this weird external circuit. So not only is this a very strange idea, but what was most interesting are the results. So this was measured on a 6 weeks baseline. The total experience was 8 minutes, and each participant did it 3 times. And after 6 weeks, the reduction in the severity of the depression was greater for virtually all patients than those in a randomized control trial who had done a therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy. So what you can see here is that something very experiential, very deep and powerful happened. So if you go to the next slide, Sarah. So what we did after that is we realized there are affordances when it comes to learning and behavioral transformation that are brought about by virtual reality. And we worked with behavioral scientists to combine those with the best practice in learning design. So we're going to start from the top circle. One best practice in learning design is emotion and affect. When you're learning through emotion, through a story, you memorize better. And this is combining virtual reality with embodiment. So obviously watching a movie on your phone or being embodied and experiencing something as if it was happening to yourself, that heightens. So the combination of affect and embodiment creates an emotional engagement with the learning that they see nowhere else besides obviously reality. The second aspect is combining application and immersion. We all know that passive learning doesn't work that well compared to applicative learning when you do stuff. It's all good to do stuff, but if you can do stuff in an environment that looks and feel like where it's going to happen in reality, you create that idea of real play. It's safe, like a flight simulator, but you're playing something that is as close as possible to the real thing. And that replaces role play. And please do raise your hand if you do not hate role play. I think it's awkward for everyone. There's no psychological safety with role play. The third element is combining exploration. So exploration, you learn better when you are in the state of flow. You probably heard about that learning theory. A state of flow is when there's a perfect match between the guidance that you have and the level of challenge. And in a state of flow, you are focused, you forget that time is passing, and there's a certain level of enjoyment. And so when you combine exploration as a learning principle with the freedom to fail in VR, when you're interacting with that little girl or with a virtual character, you can say whatever you want. Those are virtual characters. They're here 24/7. They have no judgment. They have no emotions, really. You cannot hurt them. So that creates psychological safety. And when it comes to things like conversation about race, we all had awkward conversation about race with friends and family. Psychological safety is what's missing for those conversations to go anywhere. So it's very interesting that you can increase psychological safety in VR. And finally, with this idea of swapping bodies, you are reflecting, right? And you're reflecting, and as I'll show you in a minute, you're also getting data back about what you said and how you said it. And this combination of self-reflection followed by data means that when you do reflect again, when you go back to talk to the little girl, for example, not only do you become better because you had the data, but you see yourself becoming better. So let me illustrate that with the next slide, Sarah, please. So in 2019, we were approached by Sage, the publishers in education, and they wanted to explore VR for education and specifically for nurses in psychiatry. And their original idea, like many in VR, was to say, let's do a VR experience in the shoes of a suicidal patient. Does any of you have any idea why doing a 15-minute VR experience in the shoes of a suicidal patient is a terrible idea? Anyone wants to have a go? Okay, the main reason why it's a terrible idea is because being suicidal is not an audio-visual thing. It's not about what you see or what you hear. It happens in the mind. And when it comes to race, there are a lot of experiences about, live 15 minutes in the shoes of a black person going to an all-white clinic, or in a woman walking in the street and being catcalled. There are studies that have shown that this can backfire. This will create a kind of a wow moment for many people, but for some people who might be on the extremes and might be more in need of having better conversation than other, it can backfire because they go, that's what it's all about. And this is terrible because obviously, if you're a black man and you walk in an all-white clinic, obviously I'm not a black man, so I cannot talk for that experience. But it's not what's happening. You entering this space with everything that's happened in your life before. You're not entering this space as a white guy with a headset on. This is completely different. So embodiment and embodying someone else in VR, I think, is tricky. So what we did is we took the Mel Slater experiment, but we flipped it on its head. So instead of it being about the patient, it's about the practitioner. So you get into the experience, you find yourself in front of a mirror, you read the case notes, and you're going to visit Susan in her flat. Susan is a suicidal patient. She's attempted suicide 2 times and she's not feeling too good at the moment. You are first going to listen to her story. So you can ask a few questions like in a guided way, but fundamentally she's going to talk to you in her own words about her husband, her dog, what she watches on TV, how she feels. And once she's done talking, it's going to be your turn to provide her with some feedback, with some advice, with some support. And you're going to do this in your own words. Once you're done, you're going to swap body with Susan and listen to your own words from her perspective. So viscerally experiencing, okay, this is how I come across when I'm trying to help someone out. After that, you will get some data back on how you said things, speed of talking and that kind of stuff, but also on semantic. So this was 2019, so pre-chat GPT, but we could still tell you whether you mentioned her husband, her dog, and some of the elements, right? Whether you covered some part of her story. Anecdotally, we did a test with UCL, and the results were really good. But one student in particular told us the story of coming back home that night after doing the experience, and his flatmate came into the room, and she was feeling very, very much down. And he talked to her, and the next day she came back to him and said, last night you were amazing because normally you mimic my own sadness and it's all gloomy, whereas last night you perked up and you smiled and you helped me out. And he told me that as he was talking to her, he was picturing himself being in her shoes. So it is a very powerful and practical experience. Now, if we can go to the next slide, Sarah. So Michael, do you want to, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a typical room. I'll just come on over here. And I think probably a lot of you have been in a room like this. This is an example of how traditionally anti-racism and DEI training occurs. You see here, you've got one person standing in the middle. You've got a bunch of people sitting around, some of them looking quite uncomfortable because they really don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to be in the wrong position. They don't want to appear in a way, that is insensitive. And it doesn't get a lot out of the participants because there is that fear of saying the wrong thing, or they don't even want to be there in the first place. So how do we encourage people, if we're traditionally doing it like this, where we're sitting in a room, we're putting people on the spot, how do we create a situation where they feel more comfortable having meaningful conversations? Next slide, please, Sarah. So what we did was at George Brown, I'll just come back over here. So what we did at George Brown was we got together a team of experts who teach this for a living. So these are professional educators. Charlene is a wonderful professor at George Brown, and she teaches anti-racism for a living with social service workers. And Gail works with George Brown for early childhood educators, and she's steeped in this work as well, and she's worked for some ministries across Canada. And then the wonderful Ruth, who has a really good knowledge of immersive technology and education. We got together and we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we have these conversations and how can we create them together so that we're not repeating that kind of uncomfortable circle that you saw before them. So what we did was we spent a lot of time together and we workshopped all the different things that we would want to address as we went forward. Next slide, please, Sarah. And as we were developing this, we came to some conclusions that one, a lot of times in a virtual space like this, diversity is not really represented. You don't see a lot of different avatars of different races. You don't see different body types. Oftentimes, these things are not evident. So we spent a lot of time consulting with a whole bunch of different student groups and groups within George Brown to create these avatars. So here you see on the top right there, top left, you see Miigwan. We consulted with Indigenous educators and Indigenous students at George Brown to create kind of a profile of what these characters could look like. And then the wonderful folks at Bodyswaps created those. And so when you go into the modules, you can actually see these more diverse characters as we go through. Next slide, please, Sarah. Then, and one of the really great things about VR is a sense of presence and a sense of embodiment. So if you feel, and you can't see what I'm seeing, but I'm in a VR headset, I actually feel like I'm standing in front of all of you in maybe not on the moon, but certainly in a space where I feel immersed and I feel like I'm actually present. So what we did was we made sure that the environments match the environments that the George Brown students would have in a typical college. We didn't put it in a boardroom because that's not where people have general conversations. We put it in a place where people congregate and where they talk to each other. So on the left, you see a picture of, that's the basement of one of the campuses. And then on the right, you see the 3D model or environment that was built to have those conversations. Next slide, please, Sarah. And so that's where these came from.
Yeah, so I'll show you a video in a minute, but the output of this process is 3 modules, so about 60 to 90 minutes in total, depending on how many times you repeat some of the activities. And the 3 modules are about microaggression, bias as a barrier, and recognizing privilege. And they all link to one another. You have the same the same tutors, and it follows this idea of listening into conversation, observing behaviors, making choices, and then finally expressing yourself in your own words and listening back to yourself. I believe we have a very short video to show you to bring this to life. I think Sarah has to go out of the slides and into the videos. That might take.
Even in a virtual world, it's a subtle and not so subtle barrage.
A classmate asks your Asian friend to tutor him for his math exam because they just know math, am I right?
Microaggressions, bias, and blatant racism.
You know, the Muslim guy, Ashen, Adula, Adil.
Though this is just an avatar, her words are representative of everyday discrimination.
He's so touchy about his name. You know that sounds racist, right?
In VR, Alice and other avatars are tools to help users examine unconscious bias, point it out, and then call it out. This tool is designed to help identify and verbally practice addressing prejudice in real time.
Think about the financial backing that your parents provided to you.
It even analyzes words used when confronting a bigoted avatar, then provides tips on how to approach that situation in the future.
You're going to go to a private place where no one else can hear you, and you're going to interact with this software.
I think it would really suck to have people look at the color of my skin and assume that I'm here to do them harm.
Being treated with suspicion all the time must really affect how you feel about yourself.
And did you find it valuable?
100%. Listening to just even my response, I thought, oh, I can tweak things, add more, so it was good.
All right, so that gives you an idea of, how it goes. Michael.
I was going to say, in case you didn't notice, that person in there, that was me. So my avatar, I made myself much slimmer. Not much taller, but I made myself look a little bit better than that. So what we really liked about this, and just to put you some context, so that was in the national news on on global news in Canada, and what it was showing was me going back to the same school that you saw in the introductory slide, my children's school, going back after we had developed this with Bodyswaps, when Bodyswaps had built it, going back to the school and then putting those same teachers through the experience that we've just described. So it was a really it was a really culminating moment for me personally because, I took it from hearing a conversation at a dinner table to helping create something that I thought had real value and then bringing it back to the original place where it started. And that was sort of an expose of not only VR, but how Let's Talk About Race was being used.
Great. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Just to show you, so it's going to be the next one then. Just to show you some results.
Yep, there you go.
So looking just at some data points. So in each module, we have several activities, and before and after activities, we ask the learners to rate the levels of confidence on this specific skill. So what this means is before practicing in bias as a barrier, 31% of students rated the levels of confidence 4 or 5 out of 5 when it came to the ability to see the role of unconscious bias in their own thoughts of behavior. That proportion of learners went up to 69%. If you go to the next one. Yeah, perfect. When it comes to recognizing privilege, and I think I count myself as one of those, is understanding the relationship between intersectionality and privilege. So that went from only a quarter of the students being able to understand and recognizing the concepts to 3/4 of the learners, which is again a big jump. And final slide with numbers. On the last one, which is about navigating microaggressions, you see the jump here in terms of the proportion of students who feel more confident challenging other people. So and challenging other people is having a difficult conversation about race. So obviously those data are self-reported. It's hard to measure in the real world, but if you go from a quarter of students feeling confidence doing something to 3/4, you can only assume that in the real world, some of those conversations are going to happen and a ripple effect might come from that. Next slide, please. I think you might need to press a button a couple of times.
So we've not only taken these modules to educational institutions, but we've also started to take them to some corporate settings. And here, last year, we took it to an internet provider company in Toronto, and we put all the senior executives, the CFO, the CIO, all the people managers, through a 2-day intensive VR training where we brought the VR headsets in, and all of their senior management and senior leadership got a chance to do one of the modules. And here you see the results. You can't see them from where you are probably, but again, you see significant levels of increase in confidence using strategies to respond to microaggressions. So there's that number again, 25% felt confident before and 75% felt confident after. On the top, you can also see really impressive numbers as far as their understanding, their confidence, and identifying, and this is the part that Chris talked about reflection, but identifying what are the things that they needed to improve on. And that's one of the big things about learning is, can you identify what you're missing and how do you find those pieces to help fill out what it is that you see that you don't have. So I think that shows that, within the corporate setting as well, there was a lot of uptake and a lot of interest in these kinds of modules.
But before we go to the next one, there's something that's interesting about this slide is on the bottom left, what you see is the percentage of confidence identifying the microaggressions. And 55% of corporate learners were confident identifying microaggressions before they did the training and only 45% after the training in terms of identifying those. But in terms of using strategy to respond to them, they went from 25 to 75. So what you see here in those numbers is the realization that they actually didn't know as much as they thought they know. Right. They knew, right? Which is very different from what we found in a university setting. So that tells you a lot about the fact that the work needs to happen not only at university level, but obviously in senior levels as well. If we go to the next slide, Sarah.
I was going to add on that, Chris. It was really interesting, and thank you for bringing that up. It was really interesting because at that stage, they had done a lot of work. So this was 2022. They'd done a lot of work on this. And a lot of them said, I already know this. We've done microaggressions training before. We're familiar with this content. But then when they went through it, they realized they didn't know as much as they thought they did. So that's a really good indication that, this kind of medium is really good to bring out some of those things that you would learn in a traditional setting that maybe perhaps VR can help bring out. And we got lots of feedback also from other students, other learners. At this point, there are some large colleges and universities in Canada that are starting to use this with large student bodies. So there's lots of data and lots of feedback from students, but some of the ones we got were, Michelle says that she loved this way of learning, the way the avatars spoke and explained different new definitions. It helped her understand. Sawan said, found the experience to be fun and different. So this is interesting. You don't normally associate this kind of heavy content with fun. But the students, the learners actually enjoyed having the experience. They enjoyed the conversations that they had, and they found it really engaging. And that's really important, especially with this kind of work, that people feel engaged and they feel attached to the learning that they're doing. And then Nadia said, it was very helpful to learn how we can express our emotions without harming others' feelings. That's that psychological safety piece that Chris talks about. How do you practice having these conversations when you're worried that you're going to say the wrong thing? Well, with this kind of learning modality, you can practice many, many times at home in the safety of a private space, and then you can go out and have those conversations like you've practiced them before. And the next slide, please, Sarah.
So on this one, you probably cannot read it. Those are the comments on the YouTube video that I showed you before from Global News, and those are the first comments. I didn't do any editing. First one says, I spoke with many non-Canadian born people and none of them have said racism is a serious issue. Then it goes to, every immigrant I know says wokeness is insane, and at the bottom, it's cool to consider yourself a victim these days. And those are the top comments. So I guess the point is, some of the numbers we have are impressive and interesting, and we worked in university and in corporate, but there is really a lot of work to do still in terms of having conversations about race.
Yeah, and I actually went back, Chris, and looked at the YouTube. This was from the news report, as Chris said. I looked at the news report, and the vast majority of comments were of this nature. And there were some that were, I wouldn't recommend you go do it, but there were some that were much more aggressive than this. So really, it does enhance that concept that there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still a lot of important conversations that we need to have. The next slide, please. Go to the next and final slide, I believe. Yeah, so here we are. We are back in the school. So this is actually my youngest daughter's teacher this year. So my middle daughter had her last year. My youngest daughter has this teacher this year. So this is her in the library of the Catholic school doing the modules. And over here, you'll also see, I'll wander around a bit, at the very top here, the Toronto Catholic District School Board. So the Catholic School Board in Toronto, which is about 100,000 learners, about 150 schools, they have now started to use this across people, leaders, principals, vice principals, and part of their EDI champions in the schools to start doing this kind of work as well. So we've taken it from the individual teacher in the individual school to whole school boards are now starting to look at this as a possibility, as a possible way to start having these kind of engaging conversations.
And I think that's it's about it for us today. You have our details there. You know where to find us: LinkedIn, Twitter, email, all of that. Thanks a lot for your time and coming to the moon with us.
But we've got lots of time left, so I think I'm not sure if we're thinking about raising hands for questions, or how would you like to do that?
Oh, absolutely. Please do. Yes. Thank you so much. And please give, thank you for the round of applause. This is fantastic. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? You can just unmute yourself.
If you know how.
And if not, maybe just raise your hand. I'm sorry, I'm getting lost back here in the world, so I'm a little, there we go. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Also,
does anybody,
there's probably a lot of people on PC who don't know how to raise their hands. So maybe we could just unmute.
You got it. Let me do that really quick here. Let me get out of this.
while we're doing that, for those of you who have never been in VR, I understand it can be quite an interesting experience that you're now sort of sitting next to colleagues. If you look right or look left with your mouse, you can actually see people there, which is quite an interesting experience. If you ever get
Everyone
to
has,
VR
everyone has
Hi,
the
Mitch.
ability to unmute. So just anyone who has a question, just unmute.
Hi, Mitch. Did you have a question there?
Yeah, hi. I'm from Melbourne in Australia.
Hi, Mitch.
And hi. And I just wondered how do you deal with international accents and kind of localizing the content just to give it a bit more impact?
I think that's your question, Chris.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think the answer is not. It's not so much about the accent. It's the localization. And for example, this if you see the logos are not on there, but this content has been very successful in Canada and not very much in the US. Whereas you could argue that the US also very much needs to have conversations about race. And in Europe, we're talking now about potentially doing a new version of this for the UK. And it's not so much the accents; it's just the reality of the history of the countries is very different. And so you need to, when you localize the content, more often than not, you need to go back to a subject matter expert of the country, create new characters, create new environments, and rewrite the script. So it would be very easy because it's VR to swap the characters, do a translation with ChatGPT, and off we go. We can sell it in Chile and China. But the reality is it doesn't work. To give you just an anecdote, we have another series of modules on inclusive leadership, so aimed at corporates. And one of the characters uses a word that you might hear in British series that starts with a T and means genitalia. And we had a company that was interested in running it in the Middle East, and they told us if someone uses that word here, they go to jail. Right. So to your point about the localization, thank God there's no one size fits all when it comes to conversation about race. So it is costly and time consuming, but I think it is only just, and it's the right thing to do to go back to the drawing board every time.
And Mitch, we are thanks for the question. We are also in Canada. We're looking at the possibility of putting it into a regional dialect of French. So there's French from the continent, and then there's Quebecois French in Canada. So we're looking at, you have to go out and find the voice actors and have those voice actors come in. But you can certainly create some of the more regional accents and dialects if you'd like. I think there's a question over here from Bruno.
Bruce. It's from Bruce.
Sorry, Bruce.
No, don't worry. Just from Plymouth in the UK. When you're kind of looking at, because you said about the process of taking ownership, then kind of looking at reading kind of like your case notes, kind of listening, providing advice. How long did you find that it would take somebody to start to take ownership of an avatar?
It's a very good question. I think the sense of ownership in virtual embodiment seemed to be something that was very interesting or important in the studies in like 2016, 2017. Now it seems to be pretty automatic. So we have in the onboarding now, we have a sequence of about 30 seconds where you're going to wave at yourself in a mirror and spell hello with your hands. But we find that people get on with it very quickly. What is important, however, is to have legs and arms. Is something that we found as well. Yeah.
And I could say also, I've put lots of learners through these, and the first time that they put on a VR headset, and by the way, look, the vast majority at this point are not doing it in full VR. They're doing it as probably a lot of you are on PC. But the moment that they're in an avatar and they're waving their hands and they're starting to look and feel like they're in that situation, it's very impactful. I think that adds to that sort of engagement because you really feel that presence. Because you're moving your hands around and I'm actually moving my hands, and that does make a difference to your engagement level.
I have a question. With you've talked about all the program. It's Laurel over here.
Hi, Laurel.
In the side. Hey, I'm so glad you all are here. It's been wonderful with Educators in VR working with you over the years, and I'm excited about more in the future. But with the advent of AI, being able to be programmed and add some of that flexibility to change languages and appreciate the different things to make life hopefully easier, I hope. Are you looking at including AI?
So yes, there's one thing. So AI is a thing we have 3 developers working on AI full time. It's very promising because it's very powerful, and it's dangerous because it's very powerful. And you can draw almost a spectrum from 100% scripted by humans to 100% a generative AI. And there are issues on both ends of the spectrum. In the old way, the 100% scripted, well, it becomes repetitive. It's one size fits all, and it takes a lot of time to create. But on the generative side, practice is different from learning. So yes, you can generate infinite conversation, but when do you actually learn? And so to learn, you need scaffolded activities. So let's say, for example, you're learning to play the piano. If I just give you a music sheet that is generated and I ask you to play it, and then you listen back to it and I give you some data, you're not really learning to play the piano. You need someone to come in and tell you how to sit and how to place your fingers and how to read the sheets. Like football players or soccer players, they don't play 11 aside from Monday to Friday, right? They have drills. And I think that's one of the risks of AI is like, because you can have infinite practice, learning is just practice. That's one aspect. The second aspect, limit of AI, is generative means lack of control, lack of consistency. So it's good to not have repetition, but if everyone has a different experience, no one has a consistent experience. And then finally, there's all the risk that you know about. If I ask the AI to play a surgeon, is it going to be a white male? And those kinds of things. So where to draw the line between the human learning designer and the AI is what we're working on at the moment. And the AI roadmap looks a little bit like this. The first feature that we have that is now live is in the job interview simulator, and it's giving you hyper-personalized feedback on what you answered. So if I say, Laurel, what is your greatest strength? And you tell me, well, I was the captain of the basketball team, so I'm a team player. The AI will tell you, it's fantastic, you are the captain, congratulations. That does not make you a team player. You need to give an example. Here is an example. Back in the day, we were losing a game and so on, right? So it gives you hyper-personalized feedback, but it's very controlled and safe. And what we did with that is we took all the input from all the learners around the world, we ran that against a series of prompts, and then we gave learners thumbs up and thumbs down. So we have 20 universities that are in the list of beta partners. And only if we have more than 90% thumbs up and 0% inappropriate flags do we release a feature. Right, so we're very much taking baby steps. And the 3 tick box is has to increase learning performance, has to safeguard psychological safety of the learner, and has to carry no representational bias. And so now we're going to move forward and have controlled generative conversation. So having an avatar to ask you an interview question based on the job you're applying for, fairly safe. Having an audience generative a Q&A after a presentation, fairly safe. And then progressively, we're going to move to open-ended conversation. But you can have an open-ended conversation with a character of a recruiter. Will you have an open-ended conversation with a bigot, right? Maybe there's a risk there. And finally, the last step of the vision for AI is to do generative learning journeys. So you would, for example, practice speaking in public, and we have a bunch of data on, was your voice trembling? Did you use filler words? Did you project your voice? Did you structure it right? And then based on where you are and how you like to learn and where you're starting from, maybe the software would suggest a way for Laurel to progress that would be completely different for Michael, right? And I think using AI as a teaching assistant to give personalized ways of learning is probably where it's going to end. That's the final vision. So yeah, long story short, AI is going to be great for personalization and diversity in practice, but we have to be very careful with what we do with it.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, in culturally sensitive conversations or healthcare conversations where what you say and what you experience can have a real detriment on the experience and on the learners, AI, you know, I don't think it will ever be in a situation where it can have all the cultural sensitivities. And as Mitch said from Australia, you know, it has all of those regional little quirks and language. It's not going to have that. So I would say for something like, let's talk about race, you know, AI would be something that you'd probably want to spend a lot of time thinking about before you'd actually implement it. We've got a few questions here. We've got Eric and Derek, I believe. Eric?
I was just wondering about how you guys see the role of the teacher facilitator of these sessions. And I think that ties in a little bit what you were saying, Christophe, about when do you learn? And I think that one of the things I've experienced so far is that taking people out of a headset, speaking with them about what their experience was and having a debrief has been really important. And I'm just wondering if you guys can maybe talk a little bit about that.
So from our standpoint, certainly we would not want to just give this to someone and have them do it in isolation, especially Let's Talk About Race modules. There's a lot of scaffolding and wraparound education that has to happen to get the most effectiveness out of that, right? And that involves doing some activities to get people psychologically ready to have these conversations. You can't just drop someone into this difficult situation and expect them to retain it, right? So you spend a lot of time talking about it, building up to it. The VR part, really, 25 to 30 minutes, that's the part where they get to practice. But really the impact of this educational piece is what happens after. And what happens after is then, you know, you've practiced it. Now you can come back and have some of those conversations, maybe at a deeper level. And also you can help to create action outside of this. So we know in DEI circles, a lot of the challenges that I hear from people is that strategies are built, initiatives are built, but there's no real action. And I think what the great thing about this, the debrief part of it is then you can say, okay, I've learned about my own bias. I understand my own privilege that I didn't see before. What am I going to do about it? And I think that piece is where the teacher is absolutely essential to create more stickiness in that learning and create change behavior.
And I would add something to that more on the practical side, which is something we learned the hard way, is VR facilitators and teacher are two different roles. And sometimes it's going to be the same person. You know, 5 to 10% of teachers are naturally inclined to using new technology. But for the vast majority of teachers, let's be honest, it's a burden. It's a piece of hardware. It's something they don't know how to use. They've been teaching the way they teach for years, and they don't necessarily have an incentive to change. What they like, though, is that VR is a conversation starter. You can use VR as experiential homework, so to speak. So you go to the VR lab, or you do it at home on your PC, and then what happens in the classroom is so much more dynamic and alive because of it. And we learned that for institution, you often have to tell them you're going to have to create that role. Like you're going to have to create a role of the VR facilitator, and they are not the people doing the debrief either, right? So thinking about the learning experience in that realm, you know, like you have the facilitator, you have the teacher, and you have the learner, and how they interact with one another within the curriculum is one of the hardest challenges that VR has to overcome to be very in the mainstream. It's not the content itself. There's no problem with the content. The content is always fantastic and it's always the best. It's really the integration that's the hard bit.
Well, that's some bad news. We only have time for one more question. I'm afraid.
I think Derek was it. Eric, just to follow up on what you said, Let's Talk About Race. I always saw it as a seed. It's not the tree. It's just starting the conversation, as Chris mentioned. How do we get that conversation started? Derek, I think you have the last question.
Yes, first I'd like to say thank you for, as a pilot, you've been mentioned in Flight Simulator as part of your analogy, and I think that's awesome. What you guys are doing here has been really fantastic. My question is, looking at the data that you presented, um, what part of the individuals were volunteer between the university and the corporations? Do you have data, or do you show what was, did they voluntarily do this, or were they kind of brought into a mandatory situation? And the reason why I asked that is because as I'm an educator and a communicator, and I've also done work at corporate levels for specifically an unconscious bias and done presentations in it. And what I've seen after doing the presentation and doing the questions and answers, typically it's usually the people that are not in the room that need this type of program. And so when I was looking at your numbers, I was wondering, the people that are in the room are at least open to at least, trying to understand and see it, but they're not usually the core. The core is the ones that aren't there. And so and then along with that, because you have people that are voluntarily, like you're working with the universities, but then it's the parents that, kind of, can be in conflict, that people in corporations, the associates that need to be there or not. Do you have any, do you have any background or any information on that?
I can say a little bit. Go ahead, Chris.
No, I think one of the things I want to say is it depends. I mean, you're absolutely right. It depends in some situations. In some instances, it was mandatory. In some, it wasn't. But one point that is important is the target audience. So, is this built, to put it very bluntly, is this built to change the mind of the people who are racist? Do we think that it's going to change the mind of someone who's fundamentally racist? No, it's not. Let's be honest. What this is built is to equip people who already feel like allies and who are and anti-racist, but just don't know. It's the conversation at the pub when you have a good friend that just says something, and in your head you go, I need to say something, but I don't want to kill the mood. That's kind of what it is, right? I'm exaggerating because it's more about understanding you and your privilege and all that, but it's equipping the silent majority to not be silent anymore. And if the silent majority is not silent anymore, then the behaviors that are at the extremes are less available to proliferate in the real world. And I think that's probably is the objective.
And Derek, can I give you my dream scenario? My dream scenario is that students leaving high schools and who are going into post-secondary, or new employees who are coming in and they're on probation, or new university students who are coming in and they get that first year where they need to do some training. Those become essential tools for every student, so that every student has a chance to think about these things. And right, Chris is right. You're not going to get, some people are going to leave comments like they did on YouTube. But my dream is that every person gets a chance to sit and think about who they are, where they sit in this world, what biases they have, and everybody has them, what privileges they have, and everybody has them. But to have those thoughts and to consider those before going into a situation. And if we can do that, where public schools like the Catholic District School Board of Toronto is saying, let's equip our students so that when they're going into their professional lives and they're going out into the world, they've done some of that work. And that's where I really see this being the most powerful, is getting them before they get out and equipping them with that skill.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I sadly, that's all the time that we have. Can we get a round of applause for Michael and Chris and this remarkable and very forward-thinking approach to this important work? Thank you so much for being here.
Don't go anywhere yet. I want to get a selfie.
Great. And I'll just, while Michael's setting that up, I'll just say that if you want to find out more about Michael's company, Tapvigo, or Bodyswaps, you'll see a blue button underneath their logos here, the flanking on either side of you, and you can find out more information about their companies. and the amazing work they're doing. Laurel, is there anything that you would like to say about educators in VR before I wrap it up? No. So I'll just say that, again, thank you for being here. And if you'd like to find out more about educators in VR, I encourage you to head on out to where you actually showed up in the world today. And you can also find out how to volunteer with educators in VR by clicking that blue button out there that says volunteer. Educators in VR does incredible work in this immersive community. Thanks again so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.